Alright everyone, we start off today talking about the news from China. Of course, Xi Jinping, also known as Winnie the Pooh, the now dictator of China, more or less, getting an unprecedented third term in office. So basically he's become the next Mao Zedong. Link in the description, archived of course. This is the sort of consolidation of power that can really harm a nation. It can be helpful if you have a dictator or a group of oligarchs that are pretty laissez-faire and, a benevolent dictatorship or something like that. That's unfortunately typically not what happens. Typically, the consolidation of power ends up solidifying and isolating your economy more, creating a more authoritarian culture. So while he's facing calls from both within his own nation, from within his fucking party, and from other people in the world, to liberalize the Chinese economy, to ease back some of the controls on the economy, society, it appears he's inclined to move in the other direction. You've had the first meaningful protests in China in quite some time. The idea that, by the way, you're not going to see a toppling of the Chinese Communist Party because of this. There's too much state control and tyranny. The Chinese Communist Party has reigned over the expansion of a relatively comfortable middle class. Those people aren't going to be inclined to rock the boat. They've actually created their own hated bourgeoisie in China to the tune of 50 to 100 million people, just to be clear. And a lot of people in China that live in poverty. They're not in any of the major commercial centers where protesting would do any real damage. Farmer's going to farm because at the end of the day, they have no choice. They have to go out to the fields and farm the radishes and the soybeans and shit like that, and then fucking deal with it. Things have to get pretty bad under such an authoritarian system for there to be a regime change. What could end up destabilizing China is one part Xi Jinping's personality disorder and one part happenstance. The happenstance is that we're probably looking at a deep world recession anyway, predicated on backed up bullshit that happened with lockdownerism, the world energy crisis, shortages, etc., etc. You're already seeing that. I don't know why Xi Jinping would even want to be in power when it happens. The dude must have ego issues. And the other part is that egotism. He will probably crack down further. We've seen several people expelled from the party for apparently just not agreeing with him on every issue. That's usually a prelude to bad things when that begins to happen. The consolidation of power usually is coupled with and precedes a collapse, a fall of some sort. We've seen this before. You can see the economic problems that occurred in the Soviet Union, for example, during several solidifications of state power there, in between brief periods of semi-respite. You're seeing it kind of in the United States. You saw this in Weimar Germany, by the way, as well. The center, the old center, was having trouble governing the economy, having trouble with people that naturally, because the economy sucked, unemployment was high, a lot of people were out of work, started gravitating towards organizations that were at least supplying them with boots and a piece of bread. The communists did that, the Nazi Party did that. The old center began to degrade. Their answer tends to be to try to crack down on outside groups. We're seeing it in the United States right now. We see state-level persecution, both direct and through corporations, especially now through the legal system. It's even more brazen than before, of political dissidents by the Biden stewardship. This is because times are rough. It's not because people are happy. If people are happy generally, they've got their job, they've got their savings, things are generally going well, they tend not to involve themselves in protests. They tend not to go out of their way to rock the boat because they're reasonably well off. You're always going to get some complaining from the super poor because they're super poor. Outside of that, though, if you've got a functioning system that's working well, you don't have many problems. China is beginning to show signs of those problems. You've also got a slowdown in growth there. That's probably not going to reverse. They're finally facing significant competition from other Asian powers. India comes to mind. They're trying to build up their eastern sphere with them dominant at the head, especially in the fiscal sense. The other problem is that their main diplomatic ally right now is kind of off the table economically, at least for working with the Western world, namely because of Russia's war in Ukraine. All of these things coming to a head at the same time, if you have any economic downturn. and I think that you will. It's being openly predicted by basically every economic institute in the fucking world. East and Western Bloc, by the way. They have different people and things that they blame for it, but they all basically fundamentally agree at the best we get a long-term stagnation. Xi Jinping comes into power for a third term. People in China, while they can't talk openly about it, they notice things have changed there. If you have a sudden diplomatic and political shift, and then you enter an economic crisis that begins impacting the working class, the middle class to some degree, it tends to be blamed on the people centrally in power. When the person has put themselves more into a centralized role of power, as Jinping now has, becoming again the unprecedented third-term holder, the first since Mao Zedong to have sort of that lifetime dictatorship appointment by the Communist Party there, while purging people, while engaging in more state-centric practices. There will be disproportionate blame given, which could lead to further economic problems. What you could see is a downturn forces Western investors out of the Chinese market. That would bring China tumbling down. All those posh middle-class jobs have been built by Western investors mainly. If you look at the differential, I've warned of this for years that China is a paper palace because of the way they've structured their economy. If you look at projects that are semi-privately funded, and in China you have to understand you have something approaching fascism. You have a facade free market that's quite beefy. It's under direct state control, but the state generally allows them to do whatever they want if they toe the political line. If you do what we want you to do, we'll make the notes good. If you say what we want you to say, we'll leave you alone. There's not a whole lot of regulatory red tape. If you look at their centralized projects, that is the Chinese government at some levels directly funding them explicitly, most of them fall through. Their central planning apparatus is abysmal, which is why, wiser Chinese leaders, if you can use that to describe a fucking commie, have taken that step back and created the fake free market so that people can have their iPhones and their Nike shoes and shit like that. What happens is, with those private projects, you get a much better return. It's still, it's not 100%, but it's a lot better than the centrally planned ones. If, therefore, all of those private investors begin withdrawing from projects and saying, I'm no longer going to bet on China, they're getting, there's more state control, there's a greater risk involved with investing in China because Jinping is gone on a pogrom again, and they become uncomfortable and those assets start leaving China, Xi Jinping will probably have to nationalize a bunch of shit, so he alienates a bunch more businesses. It backfires. It could lead to a debt spiral. You nationalize a couple of Western-owned business fronts in China to try to stanch the bleeding, but then it makes all the other investors nervous. They begin withdrawing their money, leaving their factories wide open. Unemployment rises, wages begin to fall, inflation probably takes hold as the Chinese government has to pump the economy, and you'd be doing this during a recession anyway. It could be very, very harmful to the people of China. Now, there's no guarantee of this. China may figure out a way to escape unscathed. It's just becoming decreasingly likely, and in the longer span of things, I think it's inevitable that China suffers a complete breakdown at some point. Again, the unfortunate part is that because of the mass authoritarianism and the constant purging of disloyal military body members, in China especially, and because of Xi Jinping moving from semi-oligarchically elected steward to something closer to a dictator, there's no guarantee that the Chinese government will be able to address the issue in an appropriate manner without millions of people dying. You could see another Chinese famine sort of situation. Meanwhile, the Communist Party would still be there. Xi Jinping right now is making it a priority to continue babbling about Taiwan instead of liberalizing the economy further, which was something that began in the 1980s and has made China rich. The West, by the way, got that ball rolling. It was basically a quasi-détente. We said, oh, well, the Soviets have come to the drawing board with us. Let's do the same thing with the Chinese communists. We'll let them know that we respect them. We'll go back on our claim that Taiwan, and this is actually the 70s, is the sole governing authority of all of China, which we did until 73 or thereabouts. We'll go back on that, recognize Beijing, and now we'll get them addicted to Coca-Cola. It worked wonders for creating a richer China, a facade-free market economy. It never drew them out of authoritarianism. Their system is not a republic, which is what they claim. It's laughable. And I find it funny There are people that look at the Western governments, and they correctly identify numerous problems with them. With Trudeau, with Macron, with whoever is going to be leading Britain next. They'll probably lead for a week before they resign again. With Biden, certainly, and others. They identify that those regimes are becoming more authoritarian, problematic, there's too much regulation, the economies are lackluster. But then they praise China, which has an amplified version of all of those problems except the economic problem, and it's creating its own extra economic problem through continuous lockdowns. They still insist that they want to get COVID cases to zero, which is absolutely impossible, and it's harming business. People have been protesting that too. It's actually remarkable to see the number of people in China that are miffed at the current situation. Normally they don't say much because they don't want to get thrown into the gulag to the third generation. That's about all. Peace out.